In this dodging and burning technique series, I want to start off with two techniques for dodging and burning. The most popular ones being the overlay mode technique, and the second one being using curves to actually dodge and burn. Now, there's two schools of thought for these specific techniques. So the first thing I want to start with here is on how to at least set them up properly. The first one to start with is the overlay mode. I'm not going to get too deep into the differences between them in this tutorial, but there is a tutorial that compares the both of them together and how they actually work. So I'm going to give you the basic setup and overview of the overlay mode technique right now. The way it starts is very simple. Well, right here we have the image set up exactly the way I normally set things up, with the retouching, color above that, noise and white check and what have you. If you read through the imaging workflow tutorials, you'll see that I actually stick to what it is that I preach. Anyway, so now I want to create a new folder. I'm going to call this Dodge and Burn, or D&B for sake of brevity. Now, the overlay mode technique works very simply. We just create a new layer. I'm going to call this Dodge and Burn layer. You can call it whatever you like. It doesn't make much of a difference. And we put this in overlay mode. Now, the way overlay mode works, if you're not familiar with it, is very simple. Anything that's 50% gray will be invisible on this layer or in the image. Anything that's lighter than 50% gray will lighten the pixels underneath it. Anything that's darker than 50% gray will darken the pixels beneath it. And if I'm not mistaken, the amount of lightness and darkness beyond 50% will dictate how light and dark the image will be below those pixels if they are not 50% gray. So, without getting too technical, we create this layer and we put it in overlay mode. We fill it with overlay neutral color 50% gray, which means that you should see nothing. You see a gray image. If I put this in normal mode, there's your, let me get rid of the color so you don't get confused. There's your 50% gray. We put it in overlay or soft light for that matter. Either one works. And you don't see anything. Now, the concept here with dodging and burning is to actually use white and black, or different opacities of white and black, to dodge and burn the specific areas. I'm not a big fan of this particular technique, but I'll show you why I'm not a big fan of this in one of the next tutorials. But I'm just going to show you how it essentially works. So let's just say that we want to actually dodge this area here. It just seems a little bit dark, and maybe she's got some other spots we want to work on. The way it traditionally works is they just create a brush. For me, I'm going to grab one about this big, and if you come up here to the to this area over here, and I'm going to put this in about maybe 30% or so, and I'm just going to paint with white. Notice my foreground color and background color. If I paint with white in this area, it will lighten, because remember what I said, anything that's lighter than 50% gray will lighten the image. Anything that's darker than 50% gray will darken, depending on the amount of white we use. So I'm using a very small amount of white, and I'm just, that's a little bit too much, so I may just change this value up here to maybe 10, very, very small, and make the brush a little bit bigger. And I'm painting with a very, very, very subtle amount of white. And see how it's starting to lighten this specific area? Now you can go across this entire image and do specific targeted dodging and burning. Now, I'm adding to this technique now. This is basically the overlay mode technique. If I want to burn, I actually change the background foreground color to black, choose my brush, and I can darken it. And bring it back and makes it darker. Okay? So I'm going to go back to my history over here and get rid of all that. Those last three. Let's bring it back to where it was. That's fine. Okay, now, what makes my life easier here, I'm going to add to this technique. What I'm going to do is I'm going to create a contrast curve. Over here, I'm just going to make a nice, big contrast curve. Because I want to be able to see, the more contrast I add to the image, the more I'll be able to see the light and dark spots that I actually want to, or the blotchiness that I want to actually repair. Now, the problem with this is that the more contrast I add, the more intense the colors get. And if we work on a file like this, we're going to burn our eyes to death, or at least exhaust ourselves. So what I decided to do a long time ago, when I started working in the studios, is to use this technique where I desaturate what I'm doing, because I don't need to see color. I just need to see luminosity. I need to see what needs to be lighter and what needs to be darker. And then I go back to my dodge and burn layer, and if I want to dodge, I change to white, and I pick the area. And notice how it's a lot easier to see what it is that we're trying to dodge and burn. More so than the naked eye. I see more grit. I get rid of it, and so on and so forth. I'm not going to go too deeply into the dodging and burning. In this one, you can actually check out the dodging and burning in some of the skin studies that we do, where I really get in depth as to how I dodge and burn. But I'm just giving this a quick overview right now, and we'll see what's what. Fine. And then when we're done, we just hide these 2 layers. And here's our dodge and burn layer. Very simple. I'm not crazy about using this technique, but again, I'll explain why in the next tutorial. This is simply using the overlay mode to generate a dodge and burn layer.